Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Strategies for Museum Data Remediation. My name is Bradley Lutke, and I will be your moderator. Before we start, I would like to provide some information about our company and introduce today's presenter. Lucidea is a software developing company specialized in museum and archival collections management solutions, as well as knowledge management and library automation systems. Our brands include Sydney, Presto, Argus, Archivera, Eloquent, and Quadrastar. Now I would like to introduce today's presenter, Rachael Cristine Woody. Rachael specializes in museum collections management systems, digitization technology, digital project management, and digital usership. During the course of her career, she has successfully launched multiple digital products that include advanced digitization technology, collaborative portals, and the migration of collection information into collections management systems. She is also a popular guest author for our Lucidea's Think Clearly blog and has provided us with many great webinars that are listed on our website. So please feel free to check out those after today's session. Take it away, Rachael.
Well, thank you so much, Bradley, for hosting us today. Thanks to Lucidea, and of course, thank you for attending today's webinar. What we're going to cover is data remediation, and we're going to define that first, just so that we're all on the same page. Then we'll start getting into the nitty-gritty of common museum data messes that tend to happen and occur over the years and sometimes decades that we're using a museum collections management system. So we'll have a common message to look for, and then we'll go over some strategies that I often use or share with my clients on how do you even go about cleaning up data messes or doing that data remediation, and how to create a plan for that. So we're going to look at the usual problems and issues that can crop up, and then how to actually put a strategy together and deal with the data. So with that, we will jump into it. Defining data remediation. So this is essentially data cleanup, and it's the process of either updating, correcting, or better organizing the data or the information that is in your collections management system. So any sort of data that you are inputting as museum registrar or curator or whomever you are doing your collection stewardship, it is all that data that you put into your collections management system that we need to make sure is ending up in the right place, that it is being entered correctly according to standards, and that it is at its most effective for you, since that's the whole point of us putting data into a system, is so that it can help us do our jobs better, as well as help reach our audiences who are interested in accessing our collections. So data standards we want to keep in mind, there are two different sets to be aware of. The first set of data standards you want to think about and select one that works best for you is the data schema. And that phrase essentially means the fields that we use, the actual structure of fields that we use for our collections management system. For most of us, the majority of us tend to use a Dublin Core data schema. And that essentially means that Dublin Core has put together a set of standard fields that are usually always present in our collections management work. So when we're talking about data schema, that is the fields that we use and that we typically see in a catalog record. The other set of standards to choose from and be aware of is the data content standards. So for us in museums, it's typically going to be cataloging cultural objects, the CCO standard. If you're in archives, it could be describing archives, a content standard. There are at least a dozen or possibly 24 content standards out there where, depending on the type of collection you have, one standard may fit better for your collection data than another. For us, we'll focus on the Dublin Core as the schema and the cataloging cultural objects, CCO, as our content standard. And that is essentially the content that goes in the field. So schema is choosing what fields are we using, and then content is the actual content of data, how we put it into those fields. And both of those work together, if we're following both sets of standards, will help make our data the most useful and the most effective. Getting into common museum data messes to look for, we're going to go through about a dozen or so, and these are going to be based on the Dublin Core schema. So we're going to take a look at specifically each of the fields that you will typically use in your collection records. And then based on CCO, based on the content standard we're referencing, what sort of information and how it's put into each of these fields is going to be reviewed. And then I'll share some of the common messes I typically see with the projects that I work on for each of these fields. So as we go through these, it's merely an introductory level, get you familiar with some of the things that we will be keeping an eye out for, and then we'll get into some strategies. So our first one is the identifier. And the identifier field is essentially the field that captures a unique number or unique name that is going to identify that particular item. So you could also refer to it as your unique identification number. For many museums, this is usually something based on your accession record. So that's the identifier that we're talking about. Common messes that I see in this field is missing data, like there's just no data in that particular field, or it's data that could be inaccurate or obsolete, especially when it comes to accession numbers. If your museum's been around longer than a few decades, chances are that there's probably been a few different numbering schemes that have been introduced throughout the years. So there can also be, if it's not missing data, it could be obsolete data. So those are some things to keep an eye out for, especially if your collections management for your museum history is quite extensive, quite long. There could definitely be some legacy data, some inaccuracies that need to be updated. The next Dublin Core field to take a look out for in Dublin Core vernacular, it's called the publisher field, but in many CMSs, we can see it referred to as like the repository field, essentially any sort of entity identifier. What we are looking for here is the actual name of your repository. So whether you're archives, heritage organization, museum, this is where you would put your specific repository name. While you are in your collections management system, this may seem silly or obvious. However, if your data ever leaves your system to go play with other data, perhaps in a collaborative portal or project, having the actual repository identified on your records is so important once your data does reach that level of access and discovery. So common messes I typically see in here is that it's an informal or shortened name for the organization. So if you're using like an acronym, if you happen to shorten the name or the way you're referring to the museum, those can cause inaccuracies later on if you are contributing your records to a collaborative portal. So needing to have your actual full repository name is going to be so much more helpful. And the whole purpose of the field is to have the full name than to use an acronym or shorter names. So that's usually the common mess I see in here, and is definitely one to keep in mind, especially if you are contributing or hope to contribute your catalog records to a collaborative portal outside of your museum. The next field is the title field. So this one is perhaps the most familiar and comfortable for us to talk about. It's the title or the name of the item that you happen to be cataloging. And some institutions will implement their own like local in-house practice as to how they enter that content. Typically, it is like a journalism style construction of the titles. So if you think about newspapers and like titles of the article, usually most of the common larger words are capitalized, and then words like and or the tend to be lowercase. Whatever content standard you are following, though, it is good to identify and then be consistent. So the common messes that I see in here is the inconsistent title style creation. Sometimes it's the journalism style appropriate capitals. Sometimes I've literally seen in here like sentence structure, which is not a title. So there can be some weird inconsistency stylings there to keep in mind. Also, if it is a vague title. So for your collection, if you are cataloging dozens and dozens of ceramics and they all happen to be of a particular like ceramic jar, etc., it is not helpful to title just like all dozens of records just ceramic jar. There perhaps needs to be some additional detail to help make it more helpful for whoever's looking or searching through those records to have a more descriptive, specific title as opposed to a vague or very common title. Next field is the creator field. And so this specific field is to help capture the creator of the actual item. This can sometimes be a person, or it could be an organization, perhaps an artist studio, for example. So either way, whether it's a person or an organization entity type, there is going to be an official creator that we would enter into this field. Now, depending on your collection, how old it is, provenance, etc., it is likely that there's a good part of your collections where you don't know the creator. And while that is true, we still want to enter something into that field so that people who are looking at our collection records, maybe it's the future collection registrar 20 years from now, or an audience member this year, if they don't see something entered into the creator field, the first assumption is usually that it was just missed. Whereas if we enter in unknown as an authoritative, we are entering in this creator, it is unknown officially. We are indicating to that audience member, to that future registrar, look, in our paperwork, we don't have anything. We've been unable to confidently identify who it was. And so we are very intentionally putting unknown in this field name. So it may seem silly to you now, but it is so incredibly helpful both for our audience and for the future collection stewards. So common messes we see in this particular field is missing data. And so using that unknown if it is unknown to you. And then the next mess that we typically see is if there is a creator entered, it can sometimes be entered in multiple different ways, therefore creating for one person, for example, the spelling or the presentation of their full name could vary several different times. So something as straightforward as John Smith could be Smith, comma John, could be John H. period Smith. Several different variations. Maybe Smith has a Y in it one time. So having that inconsistent creator information is usually the next mess to look for here. And depending on what collections management system you use, this is often a good area to do some global search, some find and replace, if that particular functionality is available to you. So just sort of stick a pin in that idea, because we will cover this in some more detail later on in the strategies section. Next field is the date field, and depending on your collection, depending on the information you have, this could be a date span, like a beginning to end date span, could be a very specific month, day, year, could just be a year, could have a circa, like you have several options here depending on what you need. And common messes we see in this field are the use of circa, whether it is abbreviated, whether it is capitalized or lowercase, whether or not it actually is a narrowing down and you can use a date span with it. So keeping an eye on that and referencing your museum content best practices should help to dictate how these date entries should occur. And if you are using something like circa, are you spelling it out? Is the first C capitalized? That kind of thing. Next up is the type field. And so for many of us in the museum field, this is going to be like an object classification. Usually this is like a dictated thesaurus that we'll use of predetermined stylings, capitalization, etc., of the different object types, or AKA classifications that we want to use. So if your collections management system happens to come with that type of hierarchy of vocabulary, definitely use it if you have it available. If you don't have it available, it is definitely worth creating your own and have it documented so that you and whoever else is doing catalog work knows that there's some specific types or classification terms they should be using. The most common mess I see in here is that there is actually just no classification entered. In earlier days especially, and depending on how overwhelmed or overworked museum staff are, this field typically gets skipped the most because the assumption is that the object title, or perhaps you've added tags or subjects later on, that those will do the heavy lifting. However, the type field can be extremely powerful, especially when we're trying to look at common collection types across multiple collections, or if we're trying to, as an outside researcher, approach, and to us, it doesn't matter what the item is called. It doesn't matter what sort of subject you've assigned to it. What really matters to them is what type of objects you have of that particular type. So this is an area or a specific field where it may not be as useful to your brain, but there are definitely use cases where this is the most important field. Next up, format. So this one is a little bit different from type. It's not going to be a set vocabulary like classification. It's going to be a little bit more specific to the item, and it will usually always include some sort of extent, like this is one container as an extent, or, and especially in the museum world, it's more common to have dimensions. So if you're cataloging a 3D object, you're going to have length, height, width. You're going to see those dimensions in this format field, which usually is alongside a type or classification field, but they are not the same thing. They do get mixed up quite frequently though, and so for some museums, they think if they have something in the type field, they don't need something in the format field or vice versa. So common messes we typically see is that there is missing data, this field isn't being used, and at the very least, we should get dimensions in here, especially as dimensions can help inform exhibit planning, any sort of conservation needs, different storage container needs, that kind of thing. So important, usually more so internally, and at the very least, trying to get dimensions recorded. Next field, description. So this field is one of the fields that can take the longest because it's usually more, at least 3 to 5 sentences worth of description. What is this item? Describing the actual physicality of it, as well as its intellectual context. So what is the significance of this item? What culture does this item represent or hold meaningful value to? What are some of the materials used in it? What are the dimensions, placement, where was it from? Any of the information that may be touched on or recorded in other fields will typically find its way into this description field as a larger narrative. This is perhaps the most informative field, both for your audience as well as for your internal staff at the museum. The description is usually the first place we start when we start exhibition planning and informing. While it may not make it into the final version of like an exhibition catalog, it's certainly the first place we start. So common messes that I see in here is that it's just completely missing. And these are usually for the much shorter object records where maybe they've done a name, date, and creator, and that's it. So missing or inaccurate or incomplete. So maybe it only has 1 or 2 sentences. The sentences are incredibly helpful or descriptive. And in that case, if it's not actually providing context, if it's not providing any sort of cultural subject significance, then it can be very hard to have any meaning for. So taking some time to put together thoughtful descriptions is important and it can be so helpful, but we also acknowledge that it can take up quite a bit of time and be labor intensive. Next field, language of materials. And so for many museum objects, there may not be any language present on or contained within your particular objects. However, there are many collections where there could be writing contained within it. For example, a photograph collection where there is actually a capture of like a sign in particular language. That is something to note. Or if you do have objects or items where there is written language as a part of it, that is another area where we want to make sure we're identifying that language. This is a standard required field. So if there is language present in whatever it is that you are cataloging, you should, according to standards, identify what that language is. Common messes I see is that it's just completely missing. A lot of internal staff tend to think this is a useless field. However, it is a standardized field. It can help inform our external audience, and it can be very important and helpful when we are contributing our records to a larger collaborative portal where the predominant language isn't always going to be English if you are US centric, or English and French if you're Canadian centric, for example. And then even if it seems irrelevant, like maybe there's just so little language to see, it doesn't matter per the standard. So just make sure that you do capture it. Next up is subject. And so the subject area is typically intended to capture like the major subject matter of that particular item. And that can be both the item itself as well as the larger cultural context that it is usually found in. And so for us, we want to make sure that we're using some standardized subject language so that if somebody's searching for canopic jar, for example, that they're getting all of the canopic jars from your museum, as well as any that may be available if they're in a collaborative portal somewhere else. This is also an area where it may make sense for your museum collection to have some of its own local authority terms. Some of our collections can be so local or so niche that there's not a standard vocabulary for them yet, so it's up to us to create some standard vocabulary. Common messes is that there's no subject selected, which definitely hampers any sort of effective search and discovery. And if there are subjects in that catalog record, the next mess that I typically see is that there's only a few that have been selected and that they are so broad that they're not actually helpful. So for my canopic jar example, if we were to just give it the subject tag of jar and somebody decided to browse jars or search for jars, they're going to get thousands of jars and not the actual like canopic jar that they were wanting or needing. Next up is rights management. And so this is where you would typically put the rights statement for the museum collections. If your museum doesn't have a boilerplate one currently, it is definitely worth creating one and using it consistently for your catalog. And the job of the rights statement is to let your external audience know what are the ways that they can use and enjoy these materials that are still respectful and adhere to any sort of restrictions you may have for those materials. The typical rights statements we will see is like a copyright statement if the museum or perhaps creators still hold copyright, or, and as is becoming much more common, if there's not a specific copyright standard in place, there's a Creative Commons license in place. Creative Commons has a few different flavors of licensure. And so there are some great options for your museum if you want to try and protect the intellectual content, yet still encourage use, especially in educational means, to select a Creative Commons license that will fit your unique needs. Common messes I see in here is that there's just no statement provided. And this is obviously, if there's no statement provided, people are going to assume that there's no restrictions and that they can use it however they want. That may not be true in actuality, but you're not helping them because you're not giving them any other information. And then there should be language that is specific to the actual rights. I see some vague or perhaps conflicting language in some of the collections I've helped to work on. So if you are going to use a rights statement, it needs to be consistent and it needs to reflect your museum's policies. So this is definitely an area where if you don't already have it, it's worth spending some time thoughtfully constructing one and then being consistent about using it. Next up is relation, and this particular field is considered an optional field, but it's only optional if there's no other collections that may be related to the thing that it is that you are cataloging. And that is usually never true. There's usually always connections, whether within your broader museum collection or with a peer museum. Maybe there's a creator's archive somewhere. There's usually always going to be some sort of relation to another collection with the item that you're cataloging. And if you are aware of those connections, you, as a good steward and connector of your collections, should be really leveraging this field to help point out where those connections are. This is very helpful to our external audience and their interests, but it also helps to serve our internal needs, especially thinking about like the registrar 20, 30 years in the future. You may be aware of a connection now that is a current and obvious connection. 30 years from now, it may not be so obvious, and that institutional knowledge is lost if you haven't written it down somewhere. So this is where you put it. Common messes is that there is no data or it's incomplete. For example, it's very vague. It may only have like an organization name, but it won't have any like a collection, specific collection name, or if it's online already, any sort of link to that collection. So I often see this field skipped just because it seems easy to skip, but it has such detrimental effects, both short term and long term. So it's definitely worth spending some time on. So those were the common areas according to Dublin Core schema. So according to the typical standard fields that we would use in a museum field for our use. Now let's talk about the strategies for effective museum data cleanup, or the more official term, data remediation. The four main ones we'll cover are the record by record strategy, the spreadsheet strategy, the find and replace, the basically within the system collections management system strategy, and then the last one, working with the actual CMS vendor and doing a vendor supported cleanup approach. So first one up, record by record strategy. And even just by its name, you can tell that it's going to be a little bit more laborious, because dependent upon the type of collections management system you have, and dependent upon whether or not that collections management system has a vendor behind it to support you, or if it's open source, maybe there is no vendor support, that can be more typical. You sometimes only have the option of doing your cleanup, opening one record at a time, cleaning one field at a time. And while that is definitely not the funnest thing in the world, it is one of our strategies. And there are some ways that we can help structure it to make it easier for us. So the strategy makes sense when you either don't have a tool that exists in your CMS and or you don't have access to vendor support. It is labor intensive, but it does, with a plan, can be useful for your data cleanup strategy. So if this is your only option, I recommend starting with identifying very discrete and achievable chunks of data cleanup to perform that review, to take a look at, okay, which fields of the ones that we just went through are either missing or there's some common messes, and then deciding in order of priority. Perhaps you choose one field and go record by record, just focusing on that field. Or if your brain is a completionist in a different way and you'd rather go record by record, but like through all the fields of each record, you can also decide to do it that way, carving out a discrete set of records to do that full review of. Either way you go, the way that will make this more achievable and not quite as daunting is doing that phased approach. So not setting out and doing like, I have to clean all 40,000 of my item records. No, instead pick like, I'm going to focus on these 50 for this week or this month and spend my time on this field or this set of records. That will help move you along and keep it at a sustainable pace for your brain to keep track of. I definitely recommend mixing the strategy up with other different collection work that you have, just so that you don't burn yourself out. Next strategy is the spreadsheet strategy. And the spreadsheet can be useful both from a data review perspective as well as a data cleanup perspective. However, it does require that you have a system where you can actually export and receive a spreadsheet of your data from. And in addition to that, that if you do some data cleanup in that spreadsheet, you will need to have the ability to put it back into your collection management system via an import and have that spreadsheet populate the updates you made on it to the records. So sort of a one step, two step there. My recommendation for this is when you use the spreadsheet strategy, if that's available to you, it can help you very clearly see all of your data in each record all at the same time. Each of the columns will have the field headers at the top. And so you can very clearly see, like if the date field column, for example, is mostly empty, or the creator field, you can see that there's 12 different John Smith spellings in there. So it helps you easily pinpoint what are some of the most obvious and necessary cleanup needs are. And then if you are able to do that step 2, you can make the changes in the spreadsheet and upload it to your catalog system. If you can't do that step 2, the spreadsheet is still helpful for you to identify all of the areas that need cleanup, but it means that you will have to pair this strategy with perhaps the record by record strategy. So you can use the spreadsheet for evaluation, but you will have to use the record by record strategy to actually implement the changes. The next strategy is the find and replace strategy. It can also mirror or be paired with like bulk update kind of strategy. For this particular one, it can be incredibly powerful if it is available to you in your CMS. However, but it does run a risk with its power. When you're doing those mass updates, you'll have to pinpoint specifically for a find and replace feature, like I need to find John Smith with the Y's, for example, and replace it with John Smith with an I, no Y's. However, you will need to make sure that you are pinpointing the correct field and that you are putting the correct find and replace data in and making sure that you're not changing other things inadvertently while you're using that feature. So work with your CMS vendor because if your CMS can do this, you most likely do have a vendor attached to it. And so working with them if you've not used that feature before to make sure you do it correctly the first time and that you understand the implications of the changes that you are making in their particular system. So I definitely recommend you take advantage of your vendor expertise if you plan on using this tool. And then the last strategy is working directly with your collections management system vendor. For many of the tools, especially now, if you have a tool with a vendor attached to it, there's usually always some sort of vendor training or support available because you're paying an annual subscription model. And part of the fees for the annual subscription is to help make sure that you get the support you need to use your system effectively. So definitely reach out and identify who your technical partners can be at that vendor company and speak with them about what it is that you're trying to achieve. Having at hand some of the data remediation examples that you may want to focus on, and then how speak with them and decide how can we best perform those cleanup needs. So reaching out, working with them, depending on the support contract that you have with them, that may adjust like just how much support you get or how often, but it's worth reaching out and getting that plan started. All right, so with those 4 strategies and perhaps using a combination of all of them, start to create a plan for yourself for how you're going to tackle your museum data cleanup. So consider the resources you have at hand, whether it is time, whether it is budget that you can use to access perhaps specific consultants or to work more with your CMS vendor, and keep the focus bite-sized. So even if your data remediation project is going to be a very large and perhaps year or years long project, keeping it bite-sized and focused and phased is going to be much easier for you to achieve successes throughout. Definitely before you embark on any sort of data review or cleanup, be very clear on what data schema is already present and that is already being used in your collections management system, and what data content standards either have been followed in the past, or if they haven't, what data standards, specifically content standards, do you want to follow moving forward? Knowing the answer to both of those will then allow you to help evaluate the data that you have and what type of cleanup needs to be done. Then assess the knowledge and technical skill that you possess, that your team possesses, and the gap of what you may need, whether that is going to be filled by a consultant, CMS vendor, maybe a new staff member, being aware of what it is that you have already and what sort of knowledge you may need. And then picking a strategy, or in this case, strategies. Perhaps it's depending on the data in your system, there's a couple different strategies. Either way, when you're looking at your data and figuring out what cleanup you need to do, and you understand what it is that your CMS is able to do, you're then able to pick one or more strategies for your approach. And then based on all of that, create some easy to follow data cleanup instructions. So being very clear in documenting what sort of data schema and content standards you're referencing, doing a bit of a gap analysis or review of the data, what data is missing, what data is inconsistent or inaccurate, and then how you are going to go about doing that cleanup for each of those fields. So writing all of that out so that everybody's on the same page, especially if it's not just you doing the data cleanup work. We do have some additional reading via Lucidea's Think Clearly blog. So we have a few posts out there on CMS best practices. We also have a couple evaluation posts. So if you want to dive a little deeper into looking at your data and how to evaluate the quality of it, we have additional reading for you there. And then essentially additional reading on how to chart your course towards a better CMS, if a migration is in the future for you, usually data cleanup is involved, and then thinking about cataloging and how to implement consistent yet sustainable cataloging according to standards. So in conclusion, we spoke about what data remediation means, and essentially it means data cleanup. We did review the common museum data messes to look for by walking through each of the Dublin core, the schema fields that are typically used. We then spoke about strategies for effective museum data cleanup, going through different scenarios where one may make more sense than the other. And then based on all of that information, how to create a plan for your museum data cleanup so that you can start tackling it in a way that is effective and sustainable. And we ended with some suggested additional reading. One last thing before I turn it back over to Bradley and Lucidea is we do have a museum projects, digital projects book out. It's the latest book that I partnered with Lucidea on, Museum Digital Projects and You, Where to Begin. So it definitely covers content and quality of our data, how we can make our digital projects better, higher quality content, etc. So I do encourage you to pick that up. Lucidea Press is offering e-copies downloadable for free, so definitely take advantage of that. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Bradley.
Thank you, Rachel, for the wonderful presentation. And if you'd like to learn more about our museum collections management system, Argus, please feel free to visit our website, or you can also reach out to us at sales@lucidea.com, and we would be happy to have a chat with you. And if you have any other questions on any of our software or on our company, our contact details are listed on the screen for you. Please stay tuned for more webinars and content related to this series. And on behalf of the Lucidea team, I thank you all for attending today, and until next time, thanks.